May 10, 1869, Promontory Point, Utah. The golden spike is driven. A nation celebrates. Photographs are taken, speeches are made. The Transcontinental Railroad is complete. A ribbon of iron stitching a fractured country back together after the Civil War. In every photograph from that day, there is a group of men who are not mentioned in the speeches, not named in the newspapers, not invited to stand near the golden spike. They are Chinese. 12,000 of them, and without them, that railroad would never have been finished. Their story is not just forgotten, it was intentionally erased. This is the iron road built on their bones. By 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad was failing. They had been trying to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains for 2 years. The work was brutal, blasting granite, building tunnels, hanging off sheer cliffs. Irish workers, the primary labor force at the time, were quitting in droves. Some walked off the job mid-shift, others died. Those who survived refused to continue. The railroad was months behind schedule. Investors were threatening to pull out. The entire project, the dream of connecting America coast to coast, was collapsing. Then, Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four railroad barons, had an idea. Crocker proposed hiring Chinese laborers. His partners laughed at him. Leland Stanford, yes, that Stanford, founder of the university, dismissed the idea. He said Chinese workers were too small, too weak, too fragile. Crocker argued back. They built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? He hired 50 Chinese workers as a test. What happened next defied every expectation. The Chinese workers didn't just match the Irish laborers, they outperformed them. They worked longer hours, they asked for less pay. They didn't drink on the job, they didn't strike. But the real story is not about their efficiency, it's about what they endured. The Sierra Nevada was the deadliest stretch. Workers had to carve 15 tunnels through granite mountains. The most famous, the Summit Tunnel, took 2 years to complete. It was 1,659 feet long, carved through solid rock at 7,000 feet elevation. There were no modern tools. Men drilled holes by hand, one man holding a steel drill, another swinging a sledgehammer. 3 strikes, turn the drill, 3 more strikes, over and over, hour after hour, day after day. When they hit the right depth, they packed the holes with black powder, later nitroglycerin, and lit the fuse. They had seconds to run. Many didn't make it. In the winter of 1866, snow buried the camps. Avalanches wiped out entire work sites. One storm killed dozens of workers in a single night. They were found frozen in their tents, still holding their tools. The railroad company didn't record their names. They didn't notify families. They simply hired replacements. If the tunnels were brutal, Cape Horn was insanity. Workers had to carve a ledge into a vertical cliff face, 1,400 feet above the American River. There was no safe way to do it, so they lowered men in wicker baskets from the top. These baskets swung in the wind. The men inside drilled holes into the granite while dangling over certain death. One slip, one rock giving way, one gust of wind. They called it work. The Chinese workers never refused. They didn't strike. They didn't demand better conditions. Why? Because they were paid less than white workers. Because they were given the most dangerous jobs. Because if they complained, they were fired and replaced within days. And because for many of them, this was the only chance they had. But there is one story that breaks the silence. In June 1867, 2,000 Chinese workers, almost the entire Chinese labor force of the Central Pacific, laid down their tools and walked off the job. They demanded what white workers had always received: equal pay, shorter hours, safer conditions. This was extraordinary. The railroad barons had assumed Chinese workers would never strike. They were docile, they said, obedient. But these men had watched their friends die. They had worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, for wages half of what white men earned. And they had had enough. The railroad barons panicked. Charles Crocker cut off all food supplies to the workers' camps. He refused to negotiate. He brought in strikebreakers, including armed guards, to intimidate the men. The strike lasted 8 days. Eventually, the workers returned. Not because they gave up, but because they were starving. Crocker made no concessions. But the strike sent a message. The Chinese workers were not passive. They were not obedient. They were men who understood their value and were willing to risk everything to demand respect. Crocker never underestimated them again. The final spike is driven. The railroad is complete. The country celebrates. The famous photograph taken that day shows a crowd gathered around the locomotives. Railroad executives, politicians, workers, Irish workers, white workers. There are no Chinese faces in that photograph. Even though Chinese workers made up 80% of the Central Pacific workforce, even though they had done the most dangerous work, even though hundreds, perhaps thousands of them had died to make this moment possible. They were not invited to the ceremony. The newspapers celebrated the heroic Irish laborers and the genius of American engineering. The Chinese workers were mentioned, if at all, as an afterthought. Orientals who had served their purpose. When the first trains crossed the country, Chinese workers were not allowed to ride them. When the celebrations ended, they were fired. And then came the erasure. 13 years after the railroad was completed, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in American history to ban an entire ethnic group from immigrating to the country. Chinese workers, who had built the backbone of the American West, were now declared undesirable. They were denied citizenship. They were barred from owning land. They were attacked in the streets, and their role in building the railroad, the very thing that made American expansion possible, was systematically erased from history textbooks, from monuments, from public memory. For decades, school children across America learned that the Transcontinental Railroad was built by American pioneers and Irish immigrants. The Chinese workers disappeared from the story. How many Chinese workers died building the railroad? We don't know. Central Pacific kept no records of Chinese deaths. When workers were killed in explosions or avalanches, their bodies were often buried where they fell, or simply left. One historian estimated the death toll at 1,200. Others say it could be much higher. Some workers died of disease, of exhaustion, of the brutal winters. Others were buried in snow and never found. What we do know: when Chinese workers died, their bones were sometimes collected by their compatriots and sent back to China for burial, so their spirits could return home. But thousands never made it back. Their remains still lie somewhere in the mountains of California and Nevada. In San Francisco, there was once a cemetery where Chinese railroad workers were buried. When the city expanded, the cemetery was dug up and the land redeveloped. The bones were moved, then lost. Today, there is no monument to the 12,000 Chinese workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, not at Promontory Point, not in Sacramento, not in Washington. There is a small plaque installed in 2014. It took 145 years. Every time a train crosses the Sierra Nevada, it travels through tunnels carved by men whose names we do not know. It crosses ledges blasted into cliffs by men suspended in wicker baskets. It passes over tracks laid by men who worked 12-hour days for half the wages, who died in avalanches, who were erased from history. The Transcontinental Railroad transformed America. It made commerce possible. It connected a continent. It built fortunes for the railroad barons, for the industrialists, for the nation. But it was built by men who were denied the right to be remembered. They were not invited to the Golden Spike ceremony. They were not included in the photographs. They were not written into the history books. But they were there. 12,000 Chinese laborers, hundreds of graves, a legacy erased but not forgotten. They built the iron road on their backs, and it is time we said their names.